Russia is in the news a little bit these days, as we all know. We tend to talk in this country, when we talk about Russia, we talk about three things: Putin, Putin, and Putin. And so I thought I would get up and talk a little bit about the 143 million other Russians. This is my talk, Bears in the Streets, the book that I've just put out about the three journeys that I'm about to tell you about. Just by way of background, a lot of people ask me, how did you get interested in Russia? This is my mother in Red Square in 1976. When I was 9 years old, my father was in the Navy. The one thing I understood about Russia was they were the bad guys and my father was fighting them. My mother decided she was going to go have vacation there. She took a tour and she went for 10 days, and I was afraid I would never see her again. She came back and then proceeded to tell me how fantastic the Russian people were, what a wonderful time she had, and how beautiful it was. And that put the seed in my head of not really understanding how they can be the bad guys and the good guys at the same time. I studied Russian in college. I lived there briefly at the very end of the Soviet era. And then in the mid-1990s, I moved to Russia to find my fortune as a writer. And I happened across this fellow, a guy named Gary Matoso, who's a professional photographer. And he had this crazy notion that he wanted to go across Russia and do a black and white photo essay, starting with this very remote lighthouse in the very far southeastern tip of Russia in Vladivostok, about 40 miles from North Korea, 7 time zones away from Moscow. He didn't really speak Russian, so he needed someone who could take 3 months and go with him and do this crazy trip. And I, of course, volunteered. And so this is Gary and me. This is kind of at the end of the trip, which is why we look a little exhausted. That's us in Moscow. But he had this other idea that was he wanted to use this thing, which is a prototype digital camera. I actually didn't even know digital cameras were in the works, and so I was really shocked when he came into my kitchen in St. Petersburg, showed me this thing, took a picture of me, popped a disc into his MacBook, and then my face came up and I shrieked, and I couldn't believe it, because this was the very early days of anybody doing much of anything on the World Wide Web. But we did this real-time website all the way across Russia. This is actually still online, by the way. If you want to check it out, Google my name in the Russian Chronicles, you can find it, complete with the admonition at the bottom that says, best viewed in Netscape 1.1 or higher. So there's Gary with his fabulous digital camera. There's me, little 28-year-old me, all excited to go on our big trip. We launched it in September of 1995. There's the route that we took. We took 3 months. We started with the lighthouse. Here's the lighthouse, Vasily, the lighthouse caretaker. We literally just showed up, knocked on the door, hey, how you doing? We're a couple of Americans coming through. Do you mind if we sit down and chat? He was very eager to chat with us. His wife, not so much. Although, as you can see, she did sort of come around, and then we ended up just having a conversation with them, and then we just went from there. There were certain places that we knew we wanted to go see. One was Birobidzhan, which is the Jewish homeland, quote unquote, set up by Stalin in the late 1920s, essentially as a way to get Russian Jews out of European Moscow and far, 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 far away. This is a gentleman named Boris Kaufman who was learning how to do the Jewish prayers in the tiny synagogue that was there. There was no rabbi, so Boris took it upon himself to lead services for the Russian Orthodox women of Birobidzhan, and they would worship Jesus in the tiny synagogue, and that was the state of the Jewish community in Birobidzhan in 1995. We continued onward. We met, our goal was to meet ordinary Russians, talk with them, find out how they were living 4 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, 1995, because it fell in 1991. This is Oleg and Sveta, married couple in Ulan-Ude, which is the capital of Buryatia. He helped us find our way to this gentleman farmer, Buryanto Tsipilma, their family, in a tiny village called Galtai, about 100 people there, and Buryanto took us in, treated us very well, slaughtered a sheep in our honor. As he was performing this act of killing the sheep, he said, "This is how Genghis Khan taught us to kill sheep." As you can see there, he's got his hand in the animal. It was quite dramatic, very generous on his part to feed us in that way. We continued on to Lake Baikal. We knew we wanted to talk to the scientists who studied the lake. This is Tanya Sitnikova, a mollusk scientist. We were fortunate enough to go out on an expedition with them onto Lake Baikal. And we saw firsthand, I mean, you'll remember in 1995, the Russian economy was not doing well at all. You know, the state-run economy goes away, the ruble is falling, you know, people are freaking out essentially. There's a very tiny layer of people at the very top who are making a lot of money and you know, kind of understand how to take advantage of this new capitalist environment. And the rest of the people are sort of like, oh my God, what do we do now? Now the Levi's stores are popping up, but the jeans cost, 3 months' salary. Nobody can buy anything, everybody's freaking out. Tanya Sitnikova, a world-class mollusk scientist, previous to my going out on the expedition with her, she had to go to the market and get the cheapest possible potatoes she could to feed the scientists on this 5-day expedition. Anya and Masha, sisters in Chelyabinsk, we spoke with them. Anya was 11 when we saw her. Here she is practicing piano in her family's living room, and her sister Masha, who was 16. And as you can see, this is really the 1990s. We've got Boris Yeltsin in. It's 4 years out from the Soviet Union. It still feels very Soviet. It feels very unsettled. And then this is, in Moscow, we met MC Pavlov, who was an up-and-coming rap star. And so Gary and I did this whole trip, and we put the whole website up, and I thought, well, this is a once-in-a-lifetime trip. This was truly amazing. I'm so fortunate to have done this. 9 years later, I call Gary and I say, we should go back and do the whole trip again and see how everybody's doing. Because at this point, in 2005, 10 years later, Vladimir Putin's been in office for 5 years. Boris Yeltsin's gone. The economy is doing much, much better. The price of oil tripled between 1995 and 2005. And I was just plain curious to see how these people were doing. Gary couldn't make it, so I enlisted another photographer to come with me, a guy named David Hilligus. And he and I did the exact same trip. And for the most part, we just showed up at people's homes, knocked on the door. Here's the lighthouse keeper and his wife, 10 years later. Here's Boris in Birbizhan, which now had a rabbi, which was shocking to me. I thought the Jewish community would just be gone, but it was not. Oleg and Sveta in Ulan-Ude, the farmer. Dima Sherbakov, research scientist. Now the Limnological Institute in Irkutsk had so much more money than they had. They had new Apple Macintosh computers. Masha and Anya, remember the sisters in Chelyabinsk? Remember the little, not so much anymore. Both fluent in English, came to pick me up in a Land Rover. MC Pavlov, still making music. So even by the end of the second trip, I knew I have to go back and do this again, of course, because this was great. So 10 years later, I decided to go again, and I decided not to take a photographer. This time I could just take photos with my iPhone. Remember that big clunky digital camera? Well, easy peasy now. I just took my iPhone. Here I am at LAX taking off, and the lighthouse keepers. Boris was gone, by the way, from Birbizhan. He finally emigrated. He went to Israel. Many of the Jewish people did. But there is a rabbi there. There is a brand new synagogue. It's So Oleg and Sveta and I, having a little beverage there, which was a not uncommon occurrence. Here's the farmer and his wife. Back on Lake Baikal, Tatiana Sitnikova, there in the dark glasses. You'll remember her from the first black and white photo. Masha and Anya were still there. World travelers, fluent in English. And MC Pavlov, and this is him at his Hare Krishna temple. He's a longtime Hare Krishna. So this was the route of the trip, and I think to understand really what's going on in Russia, it helps to understand the people. It helps to understand why is Putin in power, why is he able to have the popularity that he has. And so I just want to quickly go through 6 questions here that will sort of sum up my experience of what I saw in these 20 years of interviewing these people and talking to ordinary Russians. What does Bears in the Streets refer to? The second day that I was in Vladivostok on this third trip, a woman said to me, "All you Americans, you all think that we just have bears wandering around in the streets here." And I thought it was amusing that she was informing me what I thought about Russia. And I said to her, well, we don't really think that, but that's funny, I take your point. And I kind of filed it away. And then in the next city, another person said the same thing to me. And then in the next city, and in no fewer than 6 different people in 6 different cities said this to me. So this is now a thing, that the Russians believe that we think that they have bears wandering in the streets, quote unquote. And what I came to understand that meant was they think we don't respect them. They think we don't think that they are sophisticated or an important world player. And why is that? Well, because for a long time we didn't. I mean, if you think about it, we had, post-World War II, we had 2 superpowers in the world, the Soviet Union and us. Soviet Union collapses. Nobody cared in the 1990s in this country what was going on in Russia. People stopped studying Russian. What did they start studying? They started studying Chinese. Everybody started talking about the ascension of China as a world superpower. So this was interesting to me. I did not remember hearing people say this phrase to me about bears in the streets, but I heard it repeatedly on this trip. And so that's the first thing to remember, is that there is a very big sense there, I think, that we don't respect them, that we don't believe that they matter. And this very much plays into the second thing: do they love Vladimir Putin as much as the polls suggest? Before I went, I kept reading these newspaper articles about how, oh, they love him, and you think, well, this is rigged, right? Like, who knows? Like, this is probably the government behind this. But I can tell you, going through and dropping in on these people, I saw framed photographs of Vladimir Putin with their families on their mantelpieces or in their shkafs. I saw people had the calendars. This is from a calendar, actually. You can see Vladimir Putin holding a kitten, Vladimir Putin being a major stud on a horse, and Vladimir Putin like your favorite uncle there. But yes, people really do. For the most part, there were very few people that I spoke to who were kind of meh. And of course, Moscow and St. Petersburg are a different story. Just like New York and DC, I think, are different from much of the country here. But what I saw, just anecdotally again, but talking to many, many people in many, many different cities and towns and villages, they absolutely really support him, and for these reasons. Now, do Russians really hate America? This is a T-shirt that says «Наш ответ на санкции США». This is our answer to the USA sanctions, and it is Vladimir Putin kicking Barack Obama in the face. I can say wholeheartedly that Russians really do not like the American government. They really do not like the sense that America, feels like it is the most important nation in the world. They again, it goes back to the whole bears in the streets question. Do they hate American people? The answer to that, I would say, is no. They consume a whole lot of American television and movies, and they were exceedingly welcoming to me every time that I came. And the thing I heard over and over again was, we're so glad you're here, we're so glad you're engaging with us in a dialogue. And I think that's a very important thing to continue doing, particularly when we're in this period right now where we have so much conflict going on between our countries at the highest levels. What do they think about the state of their economy? If you look at the state of the economy in the 1990s, it was a disaster. 2005, things were much better. The price of oil was higher. People were doing well. They had credit cards. They had traveled. 2015, it was kind of in between because the ruble fell again. The ruble lost half of its value between the beginning of 2014 and when I made my trip in the fall of 2015, and it's still not doing very well. This says Topol sankcji nie boится, which means the Topol missiles do not fear your sanctions, essentially. The interesting thing to me was that people did not blame Putin. They did not blame their own government for the state of the economy. They blamed us. And so that spoke to me about the level of support that Putin has. It's very easy to be a popular leader when your economy is doing well, but when your economy is not doing well and you still have your guys back and you're mad at the other guy, then he's definitely got a very, very solid grip on power. Do the Russians hate gay people? Again, in my experience, I would say I am a gay person. I went and I chose to tell people all across Russia on this particular trip. I heard one thing over and over and over, which was, I'm fine with it, don't tell anybody else. So, in theory, it's not illegal to be gay in Russia. It is illegal to propagandize that fact. That can take any form. It's a I believe purposefully, vaguely written law so that they can choose to enforce it however they like. But basically, Russians don't mind if you're gay as long as you don't talk about it. That was my experience. And finally, two surprising trends among Russian young people to just sort of push it into the future a little bit. This gentleman here is named Misha. He's 25 years old. He started his own company called Avantage, which does events, planning and events. And he was a very ambitious guy. And I talked to him, and I talked to many young Russians like him he said, my friends my age don't really drink. They don't really smoke. Everybody goes to the clubs and exercises, the health clubs. I heard so many young Russians talking about, I only eat GMO-free foods. They're very focused on their health in a way that I did not see in earlier Russian generations. The second thing is they do seem to have more ambition in the sense of businesses, starting businesses, learning English, learning Chinese, trying to create something for themselves. If you think about it, a guy like Misha not only has no recollection of the Soviet era, he was not even born when the Soviet Union collapsed. And we have to remember this. We're not, I'm of an age where when I think about Russia, it starts back with the Soviet era. But there's an entire generation of young people who now have no recollection of it, weren't even alive then. They live in the world that we live in today. They have their smartphones, they're constantly connected, it's not the Russia of old. And we're certainly going to see this trend, I think, play out in the next couple of decades. So that's my talk. Thank you so much.